Amelia Vance believed her life had reached a dead end. Standing on a rain-slicked Boston street, clutching a termination notice that felt as cold and final as a tombstone, she knew her small apartment would be gone by the end of the week. Just moments before, she had used her last $20, money earmarked for her grandmother's medication copay, to buy a hot meal for a disoriented old man who couldn't find his wallet. She thought she had sacrificed her last shred of security for a stranger's comfort. She had no way of knowing the man, with his haunted eyes and frayed tweed coat, was Elias Thorne, the reclusive architect of the Thorne Industries empire, a man wrestling with a grief so profound it had hollowed out his world. And she certainly couldn't have imagined that less than 24 hours later, a fleet of 50 of the world's most exclusive automobiles would descend upon her street, bringing with them a life-altering proposition that would not only save her, but redefine her entire future. This is not merely a story of kindness rewarded. It is a testament to how a single act of specialized skill, born from love and honed by dedication, can illuminate the darkest corners of despair and remind a titan of industry what it truly means to build something that lasts. The dinner service at Aura, a restaurant that prided itself on minimalist decor and maximalist prices, was a tightly choreographed ballet of quiet desperation. For the staff, it was a high-wire act performed over a pit of financial ruin. For the patrons, it was simply Tuesday. For 24-year-old Amelia, or Mia as she was known, the clinking of wine glasses and the murmur of conversation sounded like the ticking of a bomb. Every order she took, every plate she cleared, was a second closer to an explosion she could no longer prevent. Mia tucked a stray strand of auburn hair behind her ear, her movements precise and economical. She was a ghost in the machine of fine dining, trained to be visible only when needed. But beneath the starched black apron, a weariness had settled deep into her bones. It wasn't just the double shifts. It was the weight of a life lived on the knife's edge. Her grandmother, Rose, was her only remaining family, a woman whose mind was slowly being stolen by the cruel thief of Alzheimer's, residing in a care facility that sent letters with increasingly red-inked letterheads. Table 7 is asking about the provenance of the scallops, Vance. And for God's sake, stand up straight. You look like you're carrying the world's burdens, not a tray of canapes. The voice was a low, condescending purr that slid through the restaurant's ambient noise like a drop of oil in water. It belonged to Julian Croft, the manager. Julian was a man who wore his ambition like a suit, 2 sizes too small, constricting and painfully obvious. In his mid-30s, he managed Aura not as a haven of culinary art, but as a complex equation of profit margins and cost-cutting, where human empathy was an unacceptable variable. He smelled of expensive sandalwood cologne and faint, ever-present anxiety. The scallops are diver caught off the coast of Maine, Julian. I've already informed them, Mia replied, her voice a low, even murmur. Her hands, though, were clenched tightly around the edge of her tray. She had learned early on that Julian fed on emotional reactions. Starving him of one was her only form of rebellion. "See that you did," he hissed, stepping into her path and blocking her way to the kitchen. He lowered his voice, a conspiratorial sneer twisting his lips. "You know, corporate is breathing down my neck about labor costs. There are a dozen people who would kill for your position. People who are a little more polished, a little less distracted. You're lucky I'm still willing to overlook your situation." The unspoken threat hung in the air between them. Her situation was the occasional desperate phone call from Rose's facility, the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. Mia said nothing. She couldn't afford to. This job, this soul-crushing, demeaning job, was the only thing keeping the final eviction notice from being nailed to her grandmother's door. The facility had given her until the end of the month. She navigated the dining room, her smile a carefully constructed mask. Aura was filled with Boston's elite, tech entrepreneurs discussing funding rounds, surgeons complaining about hospital bureaucracy, couples celebrating anniversaries with a silence more profound than any argument. As she refilled a water glass for a woman dripping in diamonds who didn't even bother to look up from her phone, Mia's thoughts drifted to the small, velvet-lined box in her locker. It contained her grandfather's watchmaking tools, miniature screwdrivers, tiny brass tweezers, a loop that had magnified a world of intricate gears and springs. He had taught her his craft, the patience and precision of bringing something broken back to life. It was a skill that felt useless now, a relic from a past that had room for hobbies and dreams. Her bank account held a precarious $28.15. In her wallet, a single $20 bill was tucked away, the co-pay for Rose's new medication, which the nurse said might help with her agitation. That $20 was a fortress wall, the last line of defense against a tide of debt and despair. The evening wore on. By 9:30 p.m., the main rush had subsided, leaving a battlefield of crumpled linen napkins and half-empty wine glasses. Outside, a persistent, miserable drizzle had begun to fall, smearing the city lights across the large plate-glass windows. "Vance!" Julian's voice echoed from the host stand. "Front!" She hurried over, her worn flats silent on the polished concrete floor. An old man had just entered, stamping his feet on the welcome mat. He was a stark contrast to Aura's sleek, cold interior. He wore a heavy tweed coat, impeccably tailored, but frayed at the cuffs and dark with rain. His silver hair was disheveled, and he leaned on a simple, unadorned wooden cane. He didn't look like a customer. He looked lost. "Seat him at table 1, Julian commanded in a low voice, a flicker of disgust in his eyes. "By the service entrance. I don't want him depressing the ambiance. If he's not ordering a full entree, have him out in 20 minutes. "He's a paying customer, Julian," Mia whispered, a spark of defiance she couldn't quell. "He's a problem. Handle it." Mia took a menu, her jaw tight. She walked toward the man, forcing the professional smile back onto her face. As she got closer, she saw that his hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from an inner tremor. His eyes, a startlingly pale blue, were clouded with a deep, consuming sadness. He looked utterly adrift. "Good evening, sir," Mia said, her voice gentle. "Welcome to Aura. There's a bit of a draft by the door. Would you prefer a warmer spot?" She deliberately ignored Julian's order and led the man to a small, secluded booth in the corner, a table usually reserved for regulars. It was quiet and out of the way, offering a small measure of privacy. The old man looked up at her, a flicker of surprise in his weary eyes. That's very thoughtful of you, miss. Thank you. Can I get you something to warm you up? Coffee, perhaps? Just a pot of tea, please, he said, his voice raspy with disuse. And the roasted chicken. Whatever comes with it. An excellent choice, Mia said with a nod. It will be right out. As she turned to leave, she caught Julian's furious glare from across the room. He tapped his watch, his message clear. She knew she was in trouble for seating the problem in a 4-top booth. But as she glanced back at the old man, who was now staring out the window at the rain with a look of profound loneliness, she found she didn't care. He reminded her of her grandfather in his final years. She didn't know it yet, but that simple order of roasted chicken was about to set in motion a chain of events that would unravel an empire of grief and build a new one from its ashes. The chicken arrived, perfectly roasted, accompanied by root vegetables and a rich juice. Maya had made sure the kitchen added an extra bread roll to the plate, a small gesture of comfort. The old man ate with a slow, deliberate pace, as if the act of chewing required all of his concentration. Mia kept her distance, polishing silverware at a nearby service station. But she watched him. There was an elegance to his movements, a muscle memory of fine dining that contradicted his disheveled state. As he finished, he sat back, letting out a long, quiet sigh. He seemed to gather himself before signaling for her. "The check, please, young lady." "Of course, sir." Mia printed the receipt, $48.50 with tax, and placed it discreetly in the small leather billfold. She watched as he reached into the inner pocket of his tweed coat. His hand searched, then patted his other pockets. A subtle shift in his posture betrayed a rising panic. He began to search more frantically, his movements becoming jerky. He half stood, checking the seat of the booth. Mia felt her own stomach clench in sympathetic dread. She knew that cold, sickening lurch, the moment you realize you are utterly exposed. The old man froze, his face paling to a ghostly white. He looked from the billfold to Mia, his blue eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and humiliation. I don't understand," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "My wallet. It was right here. I must have left it in the taxi." Before Mia could offer a word of reassurance, Julian materialized at the table. He had been circling like a shark, sensing blood in the water. "Is there a problem here?" Julian asked. His tone was deceptively pleasant, but his eyes were hard and accusatory. The old man looked at Julian, his frail composure crumbling. "I seem to have misplaced my wallet, sir. I am dreadfully sorry. I can assure you I have the funds, but if you could just allow me to make a call, my driver can be here momentarily." Julian let out a short, sharp laugh that was devoid of all humor. "Your driver? Of course. And I suppose he's driving a magical carriage pulled by unicorns. That's the oldest line in the book. You come in here, take up one of my best tables for over an hour, and now you expect a free meal." "I am not a thief," the old man said, his voice trembling, but regaining a sliver of its earlier dignity. "My name is Elias Thorne. I can assure you—" "I don't care if your name is the King of England," Julian cut him off, his voice rising, drawing the stares of the few remaining diners. "You ate, you pay, or my next call is to the Boston Police Department." "Julian, stop," Mia interjected, stepping between them. "It's an honest mistake. Look at him." Julian whirled on her, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You stay out of this, Vance. This is your fault. You coddled him, sat him at this table. You want to vouch for him? Then you can pay for him." The restaurant fell silent. The couple at the next table stopped their conversation to stare. Elias Thorne looked at Mia, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading shame. The thought of the police, of being processed like a common criminal at his age, it was a humiliation too great to bear. Mia looked at Julian's smug, triumphant face. She looked at the old man's shaking hands, and she thought of the $20 bill in her wallet. It was for Rose. It was for her peace of mind. Without it, she would have to beg the pharmacy for credit they would not give. She would have to face the head nurse's disappointed stare. It was the last dollar she could truly call her own. But then her eyes caught a detail. Hanging from a thin gold chain around the old man's neck, partially tucked into his shirt, was a small, exquisitely detailed locket. It was antique, likely Victorian, with delicate filigree work, and the clasp was broken. The tiny safety latch was bent at a precarious angle. He had been fiddling with it unconsciously throughout his meal, his thumb rubbing over the worn gold. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," Mia said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. "I'll pay for him." Julian's smirk faltered. "What?" Mia walked to the service station, retrieved her purse, and took out the crisp $20 bill. She walked back and placed it on the table alongside 2 10s and a 5 from her meager tips. She added the coins from her pocket. The total came to $48.75. "Keep the change," she said, looking Julian directly in the eye. Her gaze was not defiant, but steady and calm. Julian snatched the money, his eyes narrowing with suspicion, as if he expected it to be counterfeit. "Fine," he sneered. "Consider it your final act of charity." He turned to Elias. "You, get out, and don't ever come back." He stormed off towards the register to cash her out. Elias Thorne stood slowly, leaning on his cane. He looked at the money on the table, then back at the young waitress. "My dear," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "You shouldn't have done that. That was money you needed." "Everyone needs a little help sometimes, sir," Mia said, forcing a small smile. As she spoke, she reached out, her fingers moving with an ingrained, delicate precision. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Your locket. The clasp is broken. It's an old bricard latch from the late 1800s. They're beautiful, but terribly fragile. If you're not careful, you'll lose it." With a deftness born of countless hours spent hunched over tiny mechanisms, she used her fingernail to gently bend the tiny gold pin back into place and reseated the safety catch. It clicked shut with a satisfyingly secure sound. "There," she said. "That should hold until you can get it to a proper jeweler." Elias Thorne went utterly still. He stared at her, not as a manager or a customer, but as if he was seeing a ghost. His hand flew to the locket, his fingers tracing the now secure clasp. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and in their depths she saw the clouds of confusion and grief part for a brief, stunning moment, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated astonishment. He looked at her name tag. "Amelia," he said, the name a soft exhalation. "You have a remarkable gift, Amelia." "You should go, sir, before he comes back," she urged gently. Elias nodded, his gaze still fixed on her face. "I will not forget this," he promised, his voice low but resonant with newfound strength. "Either of it." He turned and walked out into the rainy Boston night. Mia watched him go, a sense of calm settling over her despite the financial hole she'd just dug for herself. She had done the right thing. She had helped someone, and she had fixed something small and beautiful. But as she turned to clear the table, she found Julian standing by the kitchen doors, arms crossed, a malicious smile playing on his lips. "You think you're some kind of saint, Vance?" he called across the empty room. "Touching the customers, paying for vagrants. You're a liability." He pointed a finger at the door. "Get your things from your locker. You're fired." The floor seemed to drop away from her. Fired. No job. No money. An impossible bill from the nursing home. A grandmother who depended on her for everything. She didn't plead or argue. The fight had gone out of her. She simply walked to the back, her body numb, collected her grandfather's tools, and walked out of Aura and into the rain. She had no idea that the man she had just helped was now sitting in the back of a black Bentley that had been parked a block away, holding his late wife's locket to his lips. He wasn't on the phone to his driver. He was on the phone to the chairman of his board. "Harrison," Elias Thorne said, his voice no longer raspy, but sharp and clear as cut glass. clear my schedule for the rest of the week, and get our acquisitions team on the line. I want them to find out who owns the building at 112 Harbour Street. I want to buy it. And then I want to evict the tenants. The Boston rain was cold and unforgiving, a liquid manifestation of the city's indifference. For Mia, the 2-mile walk to the bus station, she couldn't afford a cab now, felt like a pilgrimage of failure. Her cheap flats, never meant for more than scurrying across a restaurant floor, were soaked through in minutes. Each step was a cold slap of reality. She huddled under the flimsy awning of a closed bakery, shivering not just from the wet, but from the chilling certainty of her predicament. Fired. The word echoed in her mind. It wasn't just the loss of income, it was the loss of the fragile scaffolding that held her life together. Without the meager paycheck from Aura, the nursing home would begin formal proceedings. Rose, her sweet, confused grandmother, would be turned over to the state, lost in the bureaucratic maze of underfunded public facilities. The thought of Rose was a physical pain, a tightening in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She remembered her grandfather, a kind man with gentle hands and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, teaching her to handle the delicate innards of a pocket watch. "Everything can be fixed, Mia," he used to say, his voice a warm burr. "You just have to have the patience to see how the pieces fit together." But how could she fix this? The pieces of her life were scattered, the mechanism hopelessly broken. She had traded her grandmother's security for a stranger's dignity and a broken locket. Was it a fair trade? A darker, more pragmatic part of her screamed that she was a fool, a sentimental, impractical fool who was about to lose everything. She pushed the thought away, wrapping her arms around herself. No, the look in that old man's eyes, the sheer, soul-deep humiliation. She couldn't have stood by and done nothing. And the locket, fixing it had felt instinctive, a small act of order in a world of chaos. When she finally reached her tiny apartment in a worn-down triple-decker in Dorchester, it was past midnight. She unlocked the door and stepped into the silence. The apartment was sparse, but obsessively tidy. Every object had its place. On a small, sturdy workbench in the corner, her grandfather's tools were laid out on a clean velvet cloth, a silent testament to a dream she could no longer afford to entertain. The red light on her answering machine was blinking furiously. 3 messages. She knew who they were from. With a trembling hand, she pressed play. "Ms. Vance, this is Susan from the Chestnut Hill Senior Residence. We're calling about the outstanding balance. We haven't received the payment for this month, and we're now 60 days past due. If we don't receive payment in full by Friday, we'll have to begin transition procedures." The voice was professionally gentle, which somehow made it worse. The next message was the same, but less gentle. The third was from the facility's director, his tone clipped and final. Friday. She had 3 days. She sank onto a small sofa, the threadbare cushions offering little comfort. She pulled out the velvet box containing her grandfather's tools. She picked up the loop, holding it to her eye. Through the magnifying lens, the world became a landscape of minute detail. The weave of the fabric on the cushion, the tiny scratches on the wooden table. It was a world she understood, a world of logic and mechanics, unlike the world outside, which was governed by forces she couldn't see and couldn't fight. She laid her head back and closed her eyes, not bothering to cry. She was too tired for tears. She was adrift in a cold, vast ocean, and there was no land in sight. Across the city, in a penthouse apartment overlooking the Charles River, Elias Thorne was also awake. The room was a monument to wealth and taste. Dark wood, modern art, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the glittering cityscape. But the opulence was lost on him. He sat in a leather armchair, a glass of untouched whiskey on the table beside him. The tweed coat from earlier was draped over another chair, a strange, humble relic in a room of polished perfection. He held the gold locket in the palm of his hand. It had belonged to his wife, Eleanor. She had worn it every day for the 50 years of their marriage. Inside were 2 minuscule, faded photographs, one of him as a young, ambitious engineer, and one of her on their wedding day, her smile radiant. Eleanor had been the heart of his life, the compass that guided his sprawling empire. She was the one who championed their philanthropic foundation, who reminded him that the purpose of building things was to shelter people, not just to amass wealth. She had been gone for 6 months, taken by a sudden, aggressive illness. And in those 6 months, Elias Thorne, the man who could move markets with a single phone call, had become utterly, terrifyingly lost. He had started taking long, aimless walks, revisiting places they had once loved, trying to find some trace of her in the city they had built their lives in. Tonight, he'd been walking near the waterfront, a place she adored, when the grief had hit him like a physical blow, leaving him disoriented and confused. He'd stumbled into the first lighted place he saw, seeking only a moment of warmth, a brief respite from the storm inside him. And then he had met Amelia Vance. It wasn't just her kindness in paying for his meal. It was her eyes, the way she had looked at the locket, not with greed, but with the focused, intelligent gaze of a craftsman. A bricard latch from the late 1800s. Nobody knew that. It was a detail only a true expert, or Eleanor herself, would have noticed. The clasp had been broken for weeks. He'd taken it to 3 of the most expensive jewelers on Newbury Street, and they had all told him the mechanism was too old, too delicate. They had wanted to replace the entire clasp, an act that felt like a desecration. But this girl, this waitress with weary eyes and hands that moved with the grace of a surgeon, had seen the problem and fixed it in 10 seconds with nothing but her fingernail. It felt like a message sent across the veil. Eleanor had always believed in signs, in the universe providing solutions in the most unexpected ways. Elias had always been a man of logic and numbers, but now, sitting alone in the crushing silence of his apartment, he felt a flicker of something else. "Sir?" A man in a crisp suit stood in the doorway. It was Harrison, his head of security and personal assistant for 3 decades. "The team is assembled." Elias nodded, his gaze still on the locket. "Did you find her?" "We did," Harrison said, consulting a tablet. Amelia Vance, age 24, orphaned at 18, became sole guardian and provider for her grandmother, Rose Vance, who suffers from advanced Alzheimer's. She dropped out of a horology program, a school for watchmaking and repair, to care for her. She's been working double shifts at Aura for the past year. Harrison paused, his professional demeanor cracking for a moment. "Sir, her financial situation is dire. The nursing home where her grandmother resides is threatening eviction by the end of the week. Her bank account is overdrawn. That $48 she paid for your meal, it was likely intended for her grandmother's pharmacy bill." Elias closed his eyes, the whiskey in his glass forgotten. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. They smiled, they flattered, they schemed. This young woman who had nothing had not only given him what little she had, but had also given him something priceless, a piece of his wife, restored. She hadn't asked for anything. She had simply seen something broken and fixed it. "And the manager?" Elias's voice was dangerously quiet. "Julian Croft, mid-level manager with a history of staff complaints," Harrison reported, his tone laced with contempt. "High turnover on his shifts, suspected of minor wage theft, but nothing proven. He terminated Miss Vance's employment immediately after you left the premises." Elias stood up, the lethargy of his grief replaced by a cold, clear purpose. For the first time in 6 months, he felt the familiar fire of his younger days ignite within him. Eleanor had always told him his greatest strength wasn't building companies, but fixing broken systems, and he was looking at a system that was thoroughly, disgustingly broken. "Harrison," he said, walking towards his desk, "I want you to call the board of the Eleanor Thorne Foundation, all of them. Tell them to be on standby for a breakfast meeting tomorrow. A very important one." He picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. "Gerald? Elias. I know what time it is. I'm cashing in that favor from the telecom merger. Yes, that one. I need you and the usual suspects for breakfast tomorrow. No, not at the club. We're going to a small place in the Seaport district, and tell everyone to bring their checkbooks. Big ones." He made call after call, a quiet storm of financial power gathering over the sleeping city. He spoke to real estate moguls, tech billionaires, venture capitalists, and financiers. He wasn't just planning to thank a kind waitress. He was planning to make a statement. He was going to demonstrate, in the most spectacular way imaginable, what his wife had always taught him: that the smallest gear can be the most important part of the machine. "Harrison," Elias said, ending his last call, "contact the director of the Chestnut Hill Senior Residence. Pay Mrs. Rose Vance's account in full, for life, and arrange for the top neurologist at Mass General to consult on her case. Spare no expense." "Yes, sir." "And one more thing," Elias added, looking at the locket that now rested securely around his neck. "Find out where Amelia Vance lives. We're going to make a delivery." Wednesday morning dawned grey and damp. For Mia, waking up felt like surfacing from a bad dream into an even worse reality. The blinking red light on the answering machine was a constant, mocking reminder of the deadline hanging over her head. Friday. She spent the morning in a haze of futile activity. She called other restaurants, her voice hollow as she asked about openings. "We'll keep your resume on file," they all said, a polite dismissal she knew all too well. She looked through the classifieds, her heart sinking at the requirements. Degrees she didn't have, experience she couldn't claim. By late morning, she gave up. There was only one thing left to do. She had to go back to Aura. In her haste to leave after being fired, she had left the most important thing she owned, the velvet roll of her grandfather's tools. Julian's spite was one thing, but she couldn't bear the thought of him throwing them away. They were all she had left of her family, of her dream. The thought of facing Julian again made her stomach churn. But the tools were irreplaceable. She put on her coat, a shield of thin wool against the world, and began the long walk back to the restaurant. She arrived just before the lunch rush. The street was quieter than the night before. Taking a deep, fortifying breath, she pushed open the heavy glass door. The chime was a sickeningly familiar sound. Julian was at the host stand, meticulously arranging menus. He looked up as she entered, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "I'm surprised you have the nerve to show your face here, Vance," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. The morning staff, busy setting tables, all stopped to watch. "I'm not here for trouble, Julian," Mia said, her voice quiet but firm. "I left my tools in my locker. I just want to get them." Julian laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Your tools? You mean that little box of junk? I had the lockers cleaned out this morning. Anything left behind was thrown out with the trash." The blood drained from Mia's face. You threw them away?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Julian, those were my grandfather's." Company policy, he said with a shrug, clearly enjoying her distress. We're not a storage facility. Now, I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call security. You're trespassing. Tears of rage and grief pricked at Mia's eyes. He had done it on purpose. He had known what they meant to her. She stood there, frozen, the last ounce of her fight draining away. She was broken. He had won. She turned to leave, her shoulders slumped in defeat. As she reached for the door, a low rumble started, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate up from the pavement through the soles of her shoes. It grew steadily louder, a chorus of powerful, finely tuned engines. "What in God's name is that?" Julian muttered, peering out the window. Mia looked past him, and her jaw dropped. A gleaming black Rolls-Royce Phantom was pulling to a stop directly in front of the restaurant, followed by a cherry-red Ferrari. The low, resonant rumble began as a vibration in the soles of her worn-out flats, a seismic tremor that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the city. Julian, mid-sneer, paused, his head cocked. "What in God's name is that?" he muttered, his annoyance momentarily eclipsed by curiosity as he peered past Mia toward the rain-streaked windows. Mia turned, her own despair momentarily suspended, and her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a fleet. It was something far more deliberate, more terrifyingly elegant. A single obsidian-black Bentley Mulsanne, silent as a phantom, had pulled to the curb, its engine a barely perceptible purr that spoke of immense, restrained power. Following it were two other vehicles, a dark grey Aston Martin and a silver Mercedes Maybach, which parked with the quiet, unquestionable authority of entities that do not recognize parking regulations as a concept applicable to them. The street, accustomed to delivery trucks and hurried taxis, fell into a reverent hush. A uniformed chauffeur, his movements crisp and economical, emerged from the Bentley and opened the rear passenger door. From the shadowed interior, Elias Thorne stepped out. The transformation was absolute. Gone was the lost, grief-haunted old man in a frayed tweed coat. In his place stood a titan, clad in a bespoke charcoal suit that fit his lean frame with surgical precision. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and the simple wooden cane he carried no longer seemed a support, but a symbol of office. His pale blue eyes, no longer clouded with sorrow, were sharp and clear, scanning the facade of aura with an unnerving, proprietary air. From the other cars, a handful of men and women emerged, not a crowd, but a select, formidable few. An older woman with a severe haircut and a Chanel suit, a sharp-eyed man in his 50s whose face was synonymous with venture capital, and Harrison, the impeccably dressed man from the night before. They did not speak, but gathered behind Elias, a silent council of war. Julian's mind, a frantic abacus of profit and opportunity, clicked into overdrive. He saw not the man from the previous night, but the embodiment of a 5-star review, a career-making client. He smoothed his already slick hair, a rapacious, servile smile stretching his lips as he practically lunged for the door, pushing past Mia as if she were a piece of furniture. "Welcome, sir. Welcome to Aura," he gushed, his voice unctuous. "A distinct honor. I am Julian Croft, the general manager. If you would be so kind as to follow me, I shall have our finest table prepared for your party immediately." Elias Thorne's gaze passed over Julian as if he were a pane of dirty glass, and settled on Mia. She stood frozen by the entrance, clutching the strap of her worn purse, the cold dread of her situation warring with a profound, bewildering shock. The ice in Elias's eyes thawed instantly, replaced by a look of gentle, profound recognition. "Amelia," he said, his voice calm and resonant, cutting through the restaurant's tense silence. I apologize for the intrusion. I had a matter of business to attend to in the neighborhood and was hoping you might spare a moment." Julian's jaw worked, a fish gasping for air. His eyes darted between the billionaire industrialist and the waitress he had just verbally eviscerated. The equation refused to compute. "Sir, you know Miss Vance?" Only then did Elias deign to look at him. His expression was not one of anger, but of a deep, clinical disappointment, the look of an engineer finding a fatal flaw in a piece of machinery. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "I am not here to dine. I am here because of a lie." Julian blinked. "A lie, sir?" "Yes. Last night you were told my name was Elias Thorne. That was not entirely accurate." He took a step into the restaurant, his entourage following. "As of 9:15 this morning, my name, as it pertains to this establishment, is landlord. My private equity firm concluded the purchase of this building an hour ago." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the room. Julian's face went slack, the color draining from his cheeks. "And as of 10:30 a.m., Elias continued, his voice dropping even further, "following an emergency conference call with a very motivated board of directors, my name is also owner. Thorne Industries has acquired the restaurant group that holds the charter for the Aura brand." He gestured vaguely at the room. "All of it." The silence that followed was absolute. The clatter of cutlery from the kitchen ceased. The other staff members stood like statues, their eyes wide with terror and awe. Julian looked as though he had been physically struck. Mr. Thorne, I can explain. Last night was a misunderstanding. A terrible mistake on my part." "Your mistake was not in your assessment of my appearance," Elias said, his voice like the scrape of steel on stone. "It was in your assessment of value. You run a business that trades on the notion of quality, yet you possess an astonishing inability to recognize it. You saw a master craftsman and treated her like refuse. You saw a man in pain and treated him like a criminal." He turned his gaze back to Mia. "And in your haste to discard what you deemed worthless, you threw away the most valuable asset this business had." He nodded to Harrison, who stepped forward. In his gloved hands, he held a familiar roll of dark green velvet, tied with a worn leather cord. "I believe these belong to you, Miss Vance," Harrison said, his tone professionally neutral, but with a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "My security team had a productive conversation with the Municipal Sanitation Department this morning. They were most cooperative in helping us retrieve your property." Mia's hands flew to her mouth. She took the velvet roll, her fingers trembling as she felt the familiar weight of the tools within. It was a physical, grounding presence in a world that had dissolved into unreality. Tears she had refused to shed in her cold apartment now streamed down her face. Not tears of sorrow, but of a relief so profound it was painful. "You threw them away," she whispered, looking at Julian, not with hatred, but with a sudden, piercing clarity. "You knew what they meant." Julian, cornered and desperate, lashed out. "It's junk! A box of old screwdrivers! Company policy is—" "Those old screwdrivers," Elias interrupted, his voice sharp as a shard of glass, "are Bergen and Voutilainen precision instruments. That set contains a 1950s staking tool that is virtually irreplaceable. To a horologist, they are what a Stradivarius is to a violinist. They are not junk, Mr. Croft. They are a legacy, something you know nothing about." Elias took another step, his presence filling the room. "You are dismissed, Mr. Croft. Your personal effects will be couriered to you. A severance package will not be forthcoming. My auditors are currently reviewing your books. and I suspect any funds we might have offered you will be better served offsetting the significant discrepancies they are already finding in the wine inventory and cash gratuity logs. Harrison will show you out. The back door, if you please." Julian stood speechless, his face a mottled canvas of fury and humiliation. He opened his mouth to protest, but the look in Elias Thorne's eyes silenced him completely. It was the look of a man who had not merely won, but who had been playing an entirely different game from the start. Defeated, he turned and allowed Harrison to escort him toward the kitchen, his reign of petty tyranny dissolving into a pathetic, shuffling exit. The restaurant staff remained frozen, uncertain of their own fates. Elias ignored them, his full attention on Mia. The formidable counsel behind him watched her, their expressions not of pity, but of keen, analytical interest. "Amelia," Elias said gently, his voice softening. "My wife, Eleanor, had a theory. She believed that the universe occasionally puts the right person, with the right skill, in the right place, at precisely the right time. She called them linchpin moments. Last night, you fixed the clasp on her locket, a Bricard latch from 1888. 3 of the most respected jewelers in this city told me it was irreparable. They wanted to replace it, to tear out the original mechanism. You saw its heart. You understood its mechanics. And you healed it in 10 seconds, with nothing but your knowledge and your touch." He reached into his coat and produced not a business card, but a thick, cream-colored folder embossed with a simple, elegant logo, a stylized T intertwined with a balance wheel from a watch. "This is not a gift, Amelia. It is a proposition. For 6 months, since my wife passed, I have been adrift. My work felt hollow. But your actions last night reminded me of what Eleanor and I set out to build. Not just buildings and portfolios, but things of lasting value. We had always planned to launch a new arm of our philanthropic foundation, an endowment dedicated to the preservation of master craftsmanship, the dying arts, horology, bookbinding, lace-making, skills that require patience and precision in a world that values speed and disposability." He opened the folder. "The board of the Eleanor Thorne Foundation met this morning. They unanimously approved the creation of the Eleanor Thorne Artisan Guild, and they have approved its first fellowship." He slid a document across the host stand toward her. "A 5-year grant. It covers a full apprenticeship with master horologist Philippe Dufour in Switzerland. It provides a living stipend, research funding, and upon your return, the seed capital and business support to establish your own atelier, a place where things are not thrown away, but restored." Mia stared at the document, the dense legal text swimming before her eyes. Switzerland. Atelier. Words from a dream she had long since buried. It was too much. It was a fantasy, a cruel joke. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why me?" The severe-looking woman in the Chanel suit stepped forward. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "My name is Catherine Albright. I am the chairwoman of the Foundation's board. Elias showed us the security footage from the restaurant last night. We did not see a waitress paying for a customer's meal. We saw a woman, under immense personal and financial duress, with every reason to be selfish, choose an act of radical empathy. We then saw that same woman diagnose and repair a complex, antique mechanism without tools or hesitation. That combination of character and skill is precisely what this fellowship was designed to find and nurture. This isn't charity. It is, from the Foundation's perspective, a strategic investment in human capital." The venture capitalist nodded in agreement. "I've built my career betting on founders, Miss Vance. I don't bet on business plans. I bet on people with grit, specialized knowledge, and integrity under pressure. You, frankly, are one of the most promising prospects I've seen in a decade." Mia looked from their powerful, earnest faces to the velvet roll in her hands, and then to Elias. He wasn't a savior descending from on high. He was a man who had recognized a kindred spirit, another person who understood that the true value of a thing, or a person, is not on the surface, but in the intricate, often hidden mechanism within. She thought of her grandfather's words. "Everything can be fixed, Mia. You just have to have the patience to see how the pieces fit together." With a trembling hand, she reached out and touched the document. "Okay," she breathed, the single word feeling impossibly heavy, impossibly light. "Yes, okay." A slow, genuine smile spread across Elias Thorne's face. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it transformed him, chasing the last shadows of grief from his eyes. "Excellent," he said. "Harrison will handle the logistics. He has also taken the liberty of settling your grandmother's account at her care facility, in perpetuity, and has arranged for a consultation with a leading neurological team from Mass General. Consider it the Guild's first official act of business, ensuring our fellows are unburdened by distraction." He turned to leave, his counsel falling into step behind him. At the door, he paused and looked back at her, standing alone in the center of the restaurant that was, for a fleeting moment, the nexus of her past and future. "Get some rest, Amelia," he said kindly. "Your new life is about to begin. It will be demanding." As the heavy glass door closed behind them, leaving only the quiet hum of the refrigerators and the stunned silence of the remaining staff, Mia sank onto the nearest chair. She laid her grandfather's tools on the table and gently unrolled the velvet, the familiar shapes of the miniature screwdrivers, tweezers and loops, a comforting catechism. She picked up the loop, held it to her eye, and looked at her own shaking hand. Through the powerful lens, she saw the landscape of her own skin, the intricate whirls of her fingerprint, a map of a life that had, in the space of 30 minutes, been completely and irrevocably redrawn. The terror and the elation were a dizzying, terrifying storm within her. She was no longer adrift. She had been given a compass, a map, and a fleet to carry her. But the journey, she knew, was now hers to navigate. The months that followed were a dissertation in disorientation. The first week was a blur of logistics, handled with quiet efficiency by Harrison. Her lease was broken without penalty. Her few possessions were packed and put into climate-controlled storage. A new, fully furnished apartment was procured for her in a quiet, sunlit building overlooking the public garden, a place where she could visit her grandmother daily. That first phone call to the Chestnut Hill senior residence was the moment the unreality began to solidify into truth. She had dialed the familiar number, her stomach in knots, expecting to plead with the director. Instead, she was put through to a new patient advocate assigned to Rose Vance. The woman spoke of new therapies, of private rooms, of specialist consultations. Mia listened, silent, tears rolling down her cheeks as the crushing weight she had carried for years simply evaporated. But the absence of that weight left its own kind of void, a vertigo she hadn't anticipated. She would wake up in the middle of the night in her beautiful new apartment, her heart pounding with a phantom anxiety, her mind screaming that the rent was due, that Rose needed her medication. It took minutes for the reality of her new circumstances to settle, and when it did, it was often followed by a wave of inexplicable guilt. Why her? What had she done to deserve this tectonic shift in fortune, while others, just as kind, just as skilled, still struggled? She spoke of this to Elias during one of their weekly meetings, which he insisted on. They were not meetings between a benefactor and his ward, but conversations between friends. They met in the public garden, walking the same paths he had once walked with Eleanor. "It is the curse of the craftsman, Amelia," he told her, leaning on his cane as they watched the swan boats glide across the lagoon. "You see the flaws in the system. You see the imbalances, the injustices. You feel the weight of things that are not properly aligned. What you are feeling is not guilt. It is empathy. It is the same impulse that made you fix my wife's locket. You see something broken, and you feel a responsibility to mend it. Do not let it paralyze you. Let it fuel you. Master your craft. Build your business. And then you will be in a position to help mend the things you see are broken. That is how a legacy is built. Not with a single act, but with a lifetime of them." Her yacht in the Vallée de Joux, the cradle of Swiss watchmaking, was both a monastic retreat and a brutal education. Under the tutelage of Philippe Dufour, a legend who viewed watchmaking as a form of philosophy, she learned that she knew almost nothing. Her grandfather had taught her repair. Dufour taught her creation. She spent months learning to file a screw head to a perfect, mirror-polished black, a technique that served no mechanical purpose, but was a testament to the pursuit of perfection. She learned the language of anglage, of pelage, of Côte de Genève. She worked until her fingers were raw and her eyes burned, surrounded by the quiet, focused dedication of men and women who had devoted their lives to the alchemy of turning metal and jewels into a living, breathing heartbeat. She was lonely. She was exhausted, and she had never been happier. Upon her return to Boston, the next phase began. Elias did not hand her a key to a finished shop. Instead, he handed her a portfolio and a team, an architect, a commercial real estate agent, a branding consultant. "It must be yours, Amelia," he insisted. "Every detail." She chose a small, elegant storefront on a quiet side street off Newbury, a place with old brick and a large north-facing window that flooded the space with perfect, indirect light. She designed the workshop herself, her grandfather's restored workbench, the heart of the room. She named it simply Vance Horology. Elias had argued for Vance and Thorn, but she had gently refused. "The Thorn Foundation gave me the tools," she told him, "but the work must be mine." He had understood. The grand opening was not a grand affair. There were no press, no society photographers. The only guests were Elias, Catherine Albright, the members of the Foundation's board, and Rose. It was one of Rose's good days. Her eyes were clear, her memory sharp in fleeting, brilliant flashes. She looked around the beautiful, quiet shop, at the gleaming tools and the ticking clocks on the walls, and her gaze settled on Mia, who stood tall and confident in a leather apron, her hands steady, her eyes bright with purpose. "Your grandfather," Rose said, her voice a soft, reedy whisper. "He would be so proud, Amelia. He always said you had the gift, the patience to see." Later, after Rose had been taken home by her dedicated nurse, Elias stayed behind. He stood by the main window, looking out at the streetlights beginning to glow in the twilight. "Eleanor would have loved this place," he said quietly. "She loved the beginnings of things, the moment when all the pieces are finally in place, just before the mechanism starts to run." Mia came to stand beside him, wiping a smudge of oil from her hands with a cloth. "I still feel like I'm dreaming sometimes," she confessed. "Good," Elias replied, turning to her, a warm twinkle in his eye. "Never lose that feeling. It means you haven't forgotten where you came from. It's the escapement wheel of the soul, Amelia. It keeps you from running too fast. It keeps you humble. It keeps you honest." He reached into his pocket and placed a small, heavy object on the workbench. It was an old pocket watch, its gold case worn smooth with time, its crystal cracked. It wasn't ticking. "My father's," he said. "It hasn't worked in 50 years. I was wondering if the proprietor had any time in her busy schedule." Mia picked it up. Her touch was now imbued with a new confidence, a deep, cellular knowledge of the intricate world that lay beneath the dial. She clicked open the case back, revealing the silent, tarnished movement within. She didn't see a broken machine. She saw a story waiting to be told again. She saw a collection of beautiful, intricate pieces, waiting for a patient hand to bring them back into alignment, to restore their purpose, to make them whole. She picked up her loop, a familiar comfort, and fitted it to her eye. Looking up at the kind old man who had become her friend, her mentor, her family, she gave him a smile that was luminous with a hard-won peace. "I have all the time in the world," she said.